You know those moments when reality feels like it's glitching? Like someone hit the wrong button on the simulation and suddenly your ordinary Tuesday turns into an episode of a bad crime drama? That's exactly what happened when I found myself staring down two men in tactical vests claiming to have the authority to inspect my family farm. But here's the punchline they weren't expecting. My little brother is the county sheriff. By the end of this story, those fake cops were the ones in handcuffs, and the HOA president who sent them was facing felony charges. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from today, because this wild ride is just getting started. I should probably introduce myself. I'm Alex Morgan, third-generation farmer on this 120-acre piece of heaven that my grandfather purchased back in 1946 after returning from World War II. We're not talking about some hobby farm with a few chickens and an Instagram aesthetic. This is a working farm with livestock, crops, and the kind of hard-earned calluses that tell the story of early mornings and late nights. For decades, we existed in peaceful isolation, with nothing but open fields surrounding us in every direction. Then, about 15 years ago, the Oak Ridge Valley development broke ground about a half-mile east of our property line. At first, it wasn't a big deal, just some new neighbors with manicured lawns and matching mailboxes. But like any invasive species, it didn't stop at the initial boundaries. Year after year, new phases of the development crept closer to our farm, bringing with them noise complaints about roosters crowing, concerns about the smell of livestock, and constantly escalating pressure to sell our underutilized agricultural space for what they called modern community expansion. My father handled these pressures with a kind of stoic diplomacy I've never been able to master. They're entitled to their opinion, he'd say, and we're entitled to ignore it. When he passed away last year, I inherited not just the farm, but also the increasingly hostile relationship with our suburban neighbors. If only I'd known then just how far they were willing to go. It began with a notice. Not just any notice, but an emergency acquisition notice nailed to my gate like we were suddenly living in medieval times. The paper was thick, official-looking, with that fancy watermark that's supposed to make you feel small. $5,800 in fines for violations I'd never committed, 72 hours to vacate my property, and the cherry on top, it was signed by Karen Whitaker, president of Oak Ridge Valley HOA. I actually laughed when I read it, because here's the thing, I don't live in Oak Ridge Valley. I live next to it. My family's farm has been here for 3 generations, since before that development was even a blueprint on some city planner's desk. This wasn't just crossing boundaries. This was like imperialism, but with more paper clips. I photographed the notice before carefully removing it from my gate. The list of alleged violations was both specific and absurd. Improper agricultural equipment storage visible from community areas. Translation, my tractor was parked in my own barn. Unauthorized livestock fencing exceeding height regulations. These were standard fences for containing cattle. Non-compliant residential structure lacking approved exterior color scheme. My farmhouse is classic white with green trim, the same colors it's had since 1958, and the real kicker, failure to submit landscaping plan for approval prior to implementation of crop rotation. They wanted me to get permission before planting soybeans. Each violation carried fines ranging from $800 to $1,500, with additional daily penalties for noncompliance. But what really caught my attention was the fine print at the bottom. Property subject to immediate reassessment under Ordinance 15C upon change of ownership. They weren't just fining me, they were laying groundwork to seize my property. I called my neighbor Ellis, whose farm borders mine to the north, to see if he'd received anything similar. Nothing yet, he said, his voice carrying that characteristic careful drawl. But Simmons over on County Road 8 got something last month, thought it was a scam and ignored it. Next thing he knows, there's a lien against his property for unpaid HOA dues. He's fighting it in court now. Ellis paused, and I could picture him removing his cap to scratch his head, a gesture he'd made since we were kids. Something strange is happening, Alex. Did you notice any surveying activity along your east boundary? I saw people with equipment there last week, but figured you'd hired them. I hadn't hired anyone, which meant somebody was measuring my land without permission. I thanked Ellis and hung up, a cold feeling settling in my stomach as I looked out across the fields that had been in my family for generations. That's when I decided to start documenting everything, setting up additional security cameras around the property perimeter and backing up the footage to off-site storage. If someone was coming for my farm, they'd find I wasn't as easy a target as they expected. I was still reading this masterpiece of fiction when a black SUV pulled up to my gate. Two men stepped out, wearing what looked like tactical vests with patches I couldn't quite make out. The taller one approached with a clipboard while his partner hung back, hand hovering near his hip in a way that was clearly meant to intimidate. "Mr. Morgan," the tall one called out, "we're conducting an emergency compliance inspection as per Section 12 of the Expanded Jurisdiction Protocol." His voice had that practiced authority that people get when they're playing dress-up. I stayed on my side of the gate and asked the only question that mattered: "Do you have a warrant?" The clipboard man blinked, clearly not expecting resistance. "We don't need one under emergency protocols," he insisted, moving closer to the gate. His partner shifted his stance, and I noticed his hand drifting closer to what looked like a holster beneath his vest. That's when I spotted something in their windshield, a badge, but not a police badge. It was laminated, printed on what looked like heavy cardstock with HOA enforcement in bold letters across the top. As they continued insisting I let them in, I quietly snapped a photo of their vehicle and the fake badge. Later that evening, I posted it to our community forum with the caption, "Spotted the newest HOA cosplay team. Looks like Blackwater is handling lawn care these days." Within hours, my post had dozens of comments from neighbors who'd experienced similar visits, each more ridiculous than the last. The two men remained at my gate for nearly 45 minutes, alternating between threats and attempted persuasion. "This is going to go much harder for you if you don't cooperate," the taller one said, his voice dropping to what I assume he thought was an intimidating register. "We're authorized to document all violations even without property access." His partner, the one with his hand perpetually hovering near what I was increasingly certain was a weapon, finally spoke up. "You've got livestock too close to the development border. That's an automatic Class 2 violation." I couldn't help but laugh at this. The development border is a half-mile from my nearest pasture. Are you suggesting my cows are violating some kind of restraining order? The man's face darkened. "Mock all you want, but we're logging your non-compliance." That's another $500. Throughout this bizarre exchange, I kept my phone recording, capturing every word of their increasingly desperate attempts to gain access to my property. Finally, the tall one sighed dramatically and made a show of noting something on his clipboard. "We'll be back with escalation protocols in place," he warned, pointing his pen at me like a tiny spear. "Next time won't be so pleasant." As they climbed back into their SUV, I noted the vehicle had no official license plate, just a temporary tag that was conveniently obscured by mud. After they left, I immediately downloaded the video from my security cameras and the recording from my phone to a secure cloud storage. Something about their behavior, the fake badges, the vague threats, the hand near what might have been a weapon, set off alarm bells beyond just typical HOA overreach. This wasn't just annoying, it felt dangerous. I called my brother Nathan but got his voicemail, which wasn't unusual given his responsibilities as sheriff. I left a detailed message trying to sound calm despite the unease settling in my stomach. That night I walked the perimeter of my property with a flashlight, checking fences and gates, feeling strangely like a sentry in my own home. The farm that had always represented security and peace suddenly felt vulnerable, its boundaries permeable not just to physical intrusion, but to bureaucratic fiction as well. As I approached the eastern boundary nearest to Oak Ridge Valley, I noticed fresh tire tracks cutting across a rarely used access road. Someone had been on my property, and recently. I set up 2 additional game cameras overlooking that area before heading back to the house, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched from the darkness beyond my property line. The next morning my phone rang with an unknown number. I answered to hear a woman's voice, smooth as polished marble and just as cold. Mr. Morgan, this is Karen Whitaker. I'm calling to confirm you've received our official notice. She spoke with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. When I pointed out that my property wasn't part of her HOA jurisdiction, she laughed. Not a genuine laugh, but the kind that dismisses without engaging. Perhaps you haven't heard about our newly passed emergency expansion guidelines. The board voted unanimously last week. Before I could respond, she added with chilling finality, "You belong to us now." The line went dead, and I stood there, phone in hand, thinking this had to be some elaborate prank. But when I walked my property line that afternoon, I found something disturbing. Orange survey flags had been placed along my northern boundary, each marked with coordinates in permanent marker. This wasn't a prank, this was a land grab. I drove to the county office that afternoon to file a complaint about individuals impersonating law enforcement officers. The clerk at the desk looked tired when I explained what happened, but her expression changed when I mentioned the HOA. "You're case number 12, she said quietly, pulling out a form. "The other 11 are still pending." She glanced around the nearly empty office before leaning forward. "You should talk to Sheriff Morgan. He's been looking into this." I couldn't help but smile at that. "Nathan Morgan. Yeah, I know him pretty well. He's my brother." The clerk's eyes widened slightly, and she picked up her phone. 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a text from Nathan. "Don't talk about this in the office. Call me when you're alone." When I finally reached him from my truck in the parking lot, his voice was tight with professional concern. "Alex, you're not the first one, but your case is different." He paused, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. "This isn't just about fines or fences, it's about control. The last guy who got one of those notices, he was actually evicted. His land was donated to the HOA as part of some settlement, but then it somehow became Karen's personal property through some holding company. This is bigger than you think." My stomach tightened as I realized this wasn't just harassment, it was calculated theft. The next morning, I was awakened at 5:30 a.m. by the sound of a loudspeaker outside my house. "This is the Oak Ridge Valley HOA Compliance Division. Exit the premises immediately for emergency assessment." I pulled on jeans and boots, grabbing my phone to record as I stepped onto my porch. 4 black pickup trucks without license plates were parked at the edge of my driveway, each marked with only a number painted on the side and the words Civil Enforcement Division. 6 people in matching khaki outfits were spreading out across my front yard, each wearing laminated badges on lanyards. One was controlling what looked like a commercial drone hovering above my barn. Standing in front of them all was a woman I instantly recognized from her community newsletter photos. Karen Whitaker herself. Complete with clipboard, designer sunglasses, and an expensive-looking blazer despite the early hour. "Mr. Morgan," she called out with practiced authority, "we're conducting Phase 2 of our compliance assessment under Oak Ridge Extended Ordinance E. Please remain inside while we document the violations." Without waiting for a response, she gestured to her team, who began taking photos and measurements of my property. I walked down my porch steps, phone recording steadily. "You do realize you're trespassing, right? All of you?" Karen smiled thinly, adjusting her sunglasses. "Mr. Morgan, your hostility is being noted for the record. We have jurisdiction under the expanded guidelines." I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity. "You're playing dress-up in khakis, Karen. This isn't an HOA property, and those aren't real badges." Her smile vanished. "If you continue to obstruct, we'll be forced to escalate the situation." As she said this, 2 of her team members began moving toward my barn. I put 2 fingers in my mouth and whistled sharply 3 times, a signal my goats recognized as feeding time. Within seconds, a dozen goats came running around the side of the barn, heading straight for the intruders. Nothing clears trespassers like a stampede of hungry goats. Karen jumped back, nearly dropping her clipboard as the goats swarmed around her team, looking for treats and headbutts. She pulled out her phone, frantically recording. "This is a perfect example of the hostile and unsafe conditions," she shouted over the bleating. The chaos was interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel as a county sheriff's vehicle pulled into my driveway. Deputy Rodriguez stepped out, hand resting casually on her belt as she surveyed the scene. "Morning, Alex," she said, nodding to me before turning to Karen. "Ma'am, I've received reports of trespassing at this address." Karen straightened her blazer, composing herself. "Officer, we're conducting an official HOA compliance inspection under our extended jurisdiction protocols." Rodriguez's expression didn't change. "Ma'am, this property is not within HOA boundaries according to county records. You and your team need to leave immediately." Karen's face flushed red, but she maintained her composure, gathering her team with a sharp gesture. As they retreated to their vehicles, she paused beside Deputy Rodriguez. "I hope your niece enjoys applying for scholarships from a property with multiple violations," she said quietly, but loud enough for me to hear. "The school board takes community standing very seriously." Then she was gone, her convoy of black trucks kicking up dust as they sped down my driveway. Over the next few days, I noticed strange things happening around the farm. Tools moved from where I'd left them. Gates I was certain I'd closed found standing open. A section of wire fencing had been loosened. The power went out briefly one afternoon, just long enough for my security cameras to stop uploading to cloud storage. When I checked the electric fence around my livestock pasture, I found the copper wire had been cleanly cut in 3 places. Someone was systematically compromising my property, and I had a pretty good idea who might be helping them. Jason, a farmhand I'd hired about a month before the HOA troubles started, had seemed perfect on paper, always on time, worked without complaint, but there was something off about him. He asked too many questions about the security system, the property boundaries, the well locations. He rarely engaged in casual conversation, but was intensely curious about the farm's infrastructure. I decided to set a trap. I created a fake binder labeled Property Transfer Options Confidential and left it in the unlocked equipment shed where Jason often worked. Inside were blank pages except for a single sheet with nonsense legal jargon and a fake property ID number. 3 days later, the binder was gone. That night, I disabled the regular lighting around the barn but set up infrared cameras connected to a system not on the main grid. Just after midnight, the motion alerts on my phone triggered. The night vision feed showed a figure moving across the yard toward the pump house. Jason, with a flashlight and a black shoulder bag. I called Nathan, keeping my voice low as I explained what was happening. "Don't confront him alone," Nathan warned. "I'll send Rodriguez, but she's 20 minutes out." I couldn't wait that long, not with Jason near the water supply that fed both my house and my livestock. I pulled on boots and a jacket, grabbing a heavy flashlight before heading out the back door. I circled wide around the barn, approaching the pump house from behind. Jason was kneeling beside the control panel, the cover removed, a small device in his hand that looked like a timer. "Finding everything okay?" I asked, switching on my flashlight. Jason startled violently, dropping the device as he spun around. "Mr. Morgan, I was just checking. There was an alarm on the system and—" I cut him off. "Save it. I saw the footage. What's Karen paying you to sabotage my farm?" My heart was hammering in my chest as I stood there, flashlight beam steady on Jason's face despite the adrenaline coursing through me. The betrayal stung more than I wanted to admit. I'd hired Jason 3 months ago when he showed up with a decent resume and references that checked out, or seemed to. He'd worked quietly and efficiently, learning the routines of the farm, gaining access to every building, every system. In retrospect, the warning signs were obvious. The questions about property boundaries, his interest in the well system, how he always seemed to be working wherever I wasn't. But farms run on trust. When someone shows up on time and does their job, you don't typically assume they're secretly working to undermine your livelihood. The device that had fallen from Jason's hand, now lying on the concrete floor of the pump house, looked like a simple timer, but attached to it was a small black box with wires extending from one end. "What is that?" I demanded, gesturing with the flashlight. Jason's eyes flicked to the device, then back to me. "It's just a flow monitor," he said, his voice steadier now as he regained his composure. I noticed the pressure was inconsistent. Even in the dim light, the lie was transparent. "A flow monitor that you're installing at midnight without telling me, after cutting the security cameras?" My voice remained calm, but inside I was calculating how long it would take Rodriguez to arrive, whether Jason might have a weapon, whether there might be others nearby. Jason must have read something in my expression because he took a step backward, hands slightly raised. "Look, this isn't what you think." I kept the flashlight trained on him, using my free hand to text Nathan our exact location, adding possible device to convey the potential threat. The tension in the small concrete structure was suffocating as we stood in silent standoff, the only sound the gentle hum of the pump system that provided water to the entire farm. Whatever was happening here went far beyond HOA harassment. This was deliberate sabotage with potentially devastating consequences for my livestock and crops. And standing before me was not just an overzealous HOA enforcer, but someone I'd trusted. Someone who had eaten at my table and worked alongside me for months while apparently planning this betrayal. Jason's face hardened, dropping the pretense of innocence. "You think you're some kind of hero sitting on stolen land," he spat. "Karen showed me the documents. Your family swindled the original developers. This property was meant to be part of Oak Ridge from the beginning." I kept the flashlight beam on his face, noticing the bag at his feet. "What's in the bag, Jason?" He lunged for it, but I was faster, kicking it away. The contents spilled out. A burner phone, a tablet, and hand-drawn maps of my property with notes in margins. The maps had markings for trigger points, camera blind spots, and unguarded well access. One phrase was double underlined: Evacuation Activation Deck 6. On the tablet unlocked in the fall was a folder labeled Morgan Phase 3, containing reports about me as a non-compliant subject and how I was losing narrative control. While we waited for Deputy Rodriguez to arrive, I kept Jason talking, pretending to be curious about Karen's operation. He was surprisingly eager to explain how sophisticated their planning was, how they'd been working on this project for months. "It's not just your farm," he said with a hint of pride. "There's a dozen properties marked for acquisition this year alone." When Rodriguez arrived, she took Jason into custody and collected the evidence. The next day, Nathan called with disturbing news. They'd found forged documents in Jason's possession, including a quitclaim deed and property transfer forms with my name on the signature line that I'd never signed. The documents had already been filed with the county, stamped and recorded under joint ownership with Blue Ridge Development Group. When I checked the document against my actual property deed, it was obvious my signature had been scanned and pasted from other paperwork. Nathan also discovered that Karen had tried to buy my land over 3 decades ago when she worked for a development company that wanted to expand Oak Ridge Valley. That weekend, I dug through my father's old files in the basement, looking for anything that might connect to Karen or Oak Ridge Valley. In a locked box labeled Alpha Protocol, our family's code for highest importance, I found receipts, maps, permits, and carbon copy letters dating back to the 1980s. Among them was a thick notebook labeled Land Disputes, Resolved and Unresolved. Karen's name appeared numerous times throughout the pages, circled in red ink. A memory surfaced from my childhood. Karen coming to the farm in a blazer with her ever-present clipboard, my father firmly refusing to sell any part of our land. She'd said something about inevitable progress as she left, and my father had watched her go with an expression I hadn't understood then but recognized now: resolution mixed with concern. Nathan came over that evening to help me go through the documents. We found a development contract between Blue Ridge Development and something called Highland Strategic Growth Fund, with both Karen's signature and that of County Commissioner Marcus Bennett, who'd been in office for nearly 20 years. "This is bigger than a crazy HOA president," Nathan said quietly, laying out the papers on my kitchen table. "They've been planning this land acquisition for decades, waiting for Dad to pass away so they could target you instead. We also discovered a cassette tape labeled Town Council 1991, KW and Morgan. When we played it on my father's old recorder, Karen's voice came through clearly. 'This proposal benefits everyone. We need housing, infrastructure, progress.' My father's response was equally clear. 'What you mean is concrete and control.' Nathan brought over leaked HOA meeting minutes from the previous year, showing detailed plans for a rural acquisition strategy, including monitoring subject movements, mail diversion tactics, and securing outbuilding for future equipment placement. The pieces were coming together. This wasn't just about my land. It was about systematically forcing people off their properties using intimidation, forgery, and manipulation of county records. I made copies of everything, sending packets to 3 local newspapers and one directly to Karen with a note that simply said, "Game over." Her response came swiftly. A video posted to the HOA community page denying any wrongdoing and claiming I was unstable and spreading misinformation. The video was taken down within hours, but not before being downloaded and shared widely. Meanwhile, I found additional notes and maps from my father indicating that a crucial boundary of our land, one that Karen's team had been focusing on, actually belonged to Thomas Harrington, a retired property attorney who'd been a friend of my father. When I called him to explain the situation, his response was immediate. "I've been waiting for this day for 30 years. Karen tried the same thing with me back when she was still with Blue Ridge. I've kept every document." The following weekend, Karen made her final move. I was prepared. I had monitors showing every inch of my perimeter, Deputy Rodriguez parked discreetly down the road, and what I'd called Protocol Omega ready to activate. 5 black SUVs appeared at my farm entrance just after noon. Karen emerged from the lead vehicle wearing a beige blazer and sunglasses, clutching documents like royal decrees. "Under HOA emergency directive, miscarry out the discrete degrees." "Under oak," she announced loudly as her team spread out. "This property is placed under administrative control pending resolution of outstanding violations totaling $24,600. I stood on my porch, recording everything. "Every word you're saying is being recorded, Karen. The county attorney is watching this live stream right now." She hesitated for just a moment before regaining her composure. "Your intimidation tactics won't work, Mr. Morgan. We have legal authority under expanded jurisdiction provisions." With that, she signaled her team to move toward my horse barn. That's when I triggered Protocol Omega. Floodlights around the property blazed to life, and a pre-recorded announcement from Sheriff Morgan himself boomed from speakers mounted on the barn. "This is Sheriff Nathan Morgan. You are trespassing on private property without authorization. Return to your vehicles immediately or face arrest." Karen froze, looking around for the source of the voice, but her team continued advancing. That's when Thomas Harrington emerged from behind the tall grass at the edge of the field, holding a thick folder of documents. "Ms. Whitaker," he called out formally, "you are currently trespassing on my property, not just Alex's." Karen turned, her face a mask of confusion. "What are you talking about? You don't own this land." Harrington smiled, holding up a boundary survey. "I own the easement you're standing on, as established in 1982 and reconfirmed in 2010. I filed a cease and desist order this morning and initiated a class action suit against your organization on behalf of 14 property owners." Karen's face drained of color as she realized her carefully constructed plan was unraveling. "You can't prove anything," she hissed, but the confidence had vanished from her voice. Harrington handed her a court document. "Judge Michaels has already denied your organization's hold order. The court recognizes this as harassment and potential fraud." At that moment, 4 county sheriff vehicles pulled up, lights flashing. Nathan stepped out of the lead car, holding a signed arrest warrant. "Karen Whitaker, you're under arrest for fraud, forgery, impersonating law enforcement officers, and multiple violations of Civil Code 458. As Nathan read her rights, Karen stood in stunned silence, her empire crumbling around her. Her team, seeing the law arrive in force, quickly surrendered. One of them approached a deputy, asking quietly, "Do I still qualify as a whistleblower?" The news spread through the community like wildfire. That evening, neighbors gathered at my farm, bringing food and drinks in an impromptu celebration. Mrs. Jenkins arrived in her golf cart, raising her sweet tea like champagne. "I told you all she was an HOA Hitler with a hyphenated last name." Stories emerged from everyone, how Karen had threatened elderly residents with eviction for bird feeders, how she'd tried to force a disabled veteran to remove his wheelchair ramp for being non-compliant with aesthetic guidelines. On Karen's tablet, which had been seized as evidence, Nathan found emails referring to a Midwest echo test region with new coordinates. Karen, it seemed, had been just one pilot program in a larger operation. As the impromptu gathering continued into the evening, I found myself sitting on my porch steps with Ellis and 3 other neighboring farmers whose properties had been targeted in similar ways. "I got a notice about my grain silos being unauthorized vertical structures last month," said Jim Hawkins, whose family had been farming in the county even longer than mine. "Ignored it at first, then started getting certified letters about pending legal action." He pulled out his phone and showed us photos of survey markers that had appeared along his eastern property line, identical to the ones I'd found. Ellis nodded soberly. "They tried a different approach with me. A man claiming to be from the Watershed Conservation Authority said my irrigation system was causing runoff issues for Oak Ridge. Wanted to inspect all my equipment and water rights documentation." The pattern was becoming clear. Systematic targeting of farms surrounding the Oak Ridge development. Each approach tailored to the specific property, but all aimed at the same goal: acquisition. What struck me most as we shared our stories was the sophisticated nature of the operation. This wasn't just one overzealous HOA president. This was a coordinated campaign with legal strategies, falsified documentation, infiltration tactics, and apparently enough resources to employ people like Jason as long-term plants. "The question is why," said Maria Diaz, whose 20-acre organic farm had been facing similar pressure. "This can't just be about expanding an HOA's reach. There's easier land to develop than working farms." As if in answer to her question, Thomas Harrington joined our circle, tablet in hand. "I've been digging into Blue Ridge Development's investor prospectus from last quarter," he said, his attorney's precision evident even in casual conversation. "They've been promoting something called the Rural Integration Initiative to potential investors. Look at this." He passed the tablet around, showing us architectural renderings of what looked like a massive planned community, with our farms clearly visible in the layout, but transformed into something unrecognizable. My property, with its functional barns and pastures, had been reimagined as something called Heritage Farm Experience, complete with adorable red barns, petting zoos, and what appeared to be luxury farm stay accommodations. Ellis's place was labeled Artisanal Cultivation Center with rows of boutique greenhouses. "They're not just planning to take our land," I said slowly as the realization dawned. "They're planning to commodify our entire way of life." The local paper ran the story on its front page. "Hoke Ho president arrested in fake raid caught by sheriff, who is victim's brother." The image of Karen in handcuffs went viral on social media, with the Oak Ridge Valley HOA website going offline within days. High school students printed T-shirts with Karen's mugshot above the words, "Hoke, hands off agriculture." Karen's empire quickly collapsed. 6 of her team members turned state's evidence. 3 county employees were suspended pending investigation, and Commissioner Bennett announced his early retirement, citing health concerns. The development plans for my farm and the surrounding properties were revealed to be part of a massive tax scheme involving shell companies and falsified environmental impact reports. The aftermath brought a strange mix of relief and unease to our community. While Karen awaited trial, released on a substantial bail that reportedly came from an anonymous source, the legal proceedings revealed layers of corruption that stunned even the most cynical among us. Court documents showed that Oak Ridge Valley had been established not primarily as a residential community, but as a foothold for a much larger development strategy. The HOA structure, with its Byzantine rules and aggressive enforcement, had been designed from the beginning as a tool for territorial expansion. Karen had been recruited specifically for her background in real estate law and her reputation for ruthless efficiency. In her initial interview with Blue Ridge Development, she had apparently described herself as willing to operate in regulatory gray areas to achieve definitive results. Corporate speak for breaking rules without technically breaking laws. The investigation uncovered a network of shell companies, all leading back to Highland Strategic Growth Fund, which itself was owned by a maze of international holding companies. The complexity of the ownership structure had effectively obscured the fact that the same entity targeting our farms had also funded the campaigns of 3 county commissioners, including Bennett, who had subsequently voted to approve zoning changes that made the HOA expansion strategy possible. More disturbing were the emails between Karen and someone identified only as Regional Director, discussing the necessary creation of environmental emergencies to facilitate property acquisition. The device Jason had attempted to install in my pump house, according to forensic analysis, was designed to introduce controlled amounts of contaminants into the water system, enough to trigger environmental violations that would have given county officials leverage to condemn portions of my property. As the legal proceedings continued, I found myself becoming something of a reluctant local celebrity. People I'd never met would approach me in the feed store or at the farmer's market, wanting to share their own HOA horror stories or simply to shake my hand for standing up to the system. Local news stations requested interviews, which I mostly declined, uncomfortable with the spotlight. Karen's operation, it turned out, was not unique. Similar tactics had been documented in rural communities across 5 states, always following the same playbook. Establish a development beachhead, create an aggressive HOA, target surrounding properties through intimidation and legal manipulation, then expand. The scale suggested coordination beyond what a single development company should have been capable of, pointing to what Nathan had started calling an organized land grab, disguised as suburban expansion. I reached out to Emma Winters, a small farm owner 2 counties over, who had received a similar letter. We shared evidence, and she filed for a restraining order with help from the state attorney's office. 4 more landowners across 3 states came forward with identical intimidation patterns. We turned everything over to the state attorney general's office, which launched a multi-state investigation into what they called systematic rural property fraud. The legal proceedings against Karen and her accomplices moved forward with deliberate slowness, the wheels of justice turning at their usual glacial pace. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened in our community. The legitimate residents of Oak Ridge Valley, the people who had bought homes there believing they were joining a normal suburban neighborhood, began reaching out to those of us who had been targeted. Many were horrified to learn how their HOA fees had been used and how their community had been weaponized against their rural neighbors. A group called Oak Ridge Farm Alliance formed, dedicated to rebuilding relationships and creating new HOA bylaws that explicitly prohibited expansion beyond the development's original boundaries. Sarah Chen, who had moved to Oak Ridge Valley just 6 months earlier, became the Alliance's unofficial spokesperson. "We bought here because we loved the idea of living close to working farms," she told me over coffee at my kitchen table. "The views, the seasonal rhythms, knowing where our food comes from. That's what made this place special. We never wanted to destroy what attracted us here in the first place." Sarah and her neighbors had begun organizing community events that brought together the development residents and the surrounding farm families. Harvest festivals, farm-to-table dinners, educational workshops where farm kids taught suburban kids about agriculture. These small steps toward reconciliation couldn't undo the damage caused by Karen's regime, but they offered hope that different ways of life could coexist without one trying to consume the other. Thomas Harrington, whose legal expertise had been instrumental in stopping Karen's land grab, became increasingly concerned about the broader implications of what we had uncovered. "This isn't just about HOAs overstepping," he explained during one of our strategy sessions. "What we're seeing is a systematic attempt to circumvent normal land acquisition processes. They're using quasi-governmental entities, HOAs with enforcement powers but without constitutional constraints, to do what actual government couldn't legally do." He had begun collaborating with legal scholars at the state university to document these tactics and develop legislative proposals to prevent them in the future. "Rural land rights shouldn't depend on having a sheriff for a brother," he said with a wry smile in my direction. 6 weeks after Karen's arrest, with summer fading into early fall, I was in the field checking irrigation lines when Nathan's patrol car came bumping down the access road. His expression as he got out told me this wasn't a social call. "They dropped the most serious charges against Karen yesterday," he said without preamble. I straightened up, wiping my hands on my jeans. How is that possible? We had solid evidence. Nathan's jaw tightened. The DA says the chain of custody on the tablet evidence was compromised, and 3 of the witnesses have suddenly changed their stories. He kicked at a clod of dirt. Someone got to them, Alex. Someone with serious influence. The implications hung in the air between us. This wasn't just about one corrupt HOA president or even one development company. The forces at work had reach into the prosecutor's office, into law enforcement, into the halls where justice was supposed to be administered. "So she walks?" I asked, the taste of defeat bitter in my mouth. Nathan shook his head. "Not entirely. She'll still face some charges, but the fraud and conspiracy counts are gone. She'll probably get probation, maybe a fine." He hesitated, then added, "And there's something else. The county records office had a break-in last night. Nothing was stolen, but someone accessed the property records database, specifically the files related to your farm and 6 others that were targeted. A month after Karen's arrest, I received a black envelope with a wax seal bearing a triangular symbol superimposed over a house. Inside was a single sheet of paper with new coordinates. Different from the ones on Karen's tablet, but following the same pattern. This story, it seemed, wasn't over yet. As I added the paper to my growing evidence file, I couldn't help but think about what my father had always said about land. They're not making any more of it, so those who control it control the future. The morning after receiving the envelope, I walked to the highest point on my property, a gentle rise that offered views in all directions of my fields and pastures, of Ellis's Place to the north, of Oak Ridge Valley to the east with its uniform rooftops and carefully planned roads. In the distance, beyond the development, I could make out construction vehicles breaking ground on what would become Phase 6 of Oak Ridge Valley, creeping ever closer to the next farm over. And I realized that while we had won a battle, the war for rural America was far from over. Karen had been just one lieutenant in a much larger campaign, a campaign that was playing out in small communities across the country, far from the spotlight of national media attention. Standing there with the soil my grandfather had worked beneath my feet, I made a decision. The coordinates in that black envelope were an invitation, or perhaps a challenge. Either way, I intended to follow them, to map the full extent of what we were facing. Because this wasn't just about saving my farm anymore. It was about exposing a system that treated generations of rural heritage as nothing more than underutilized assets on a balance sheet. If you think Karen was the end of this story, you haven't seen the rest of the map. So, what would you do if you found someone trying to steal your property through fake legal documents? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell to catch part 2 of this story, where we follow the coordinates and discover just how deep this conspiracy goes. Because this fight isn't just about my farm. It's about protecting everyone's right to their property against those who believe rules don't apply to them. Stay tuned and remember, always check for the real badges.